Good evening, everyone. Welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. Oops, sorry. Try that again. Good evening and welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. Can you see the sound levels? Are they looking good? Yeah, hello. So don't worry about it. We'll just see if it does. Tonight we are celebrating the parinirvana. That's the word for when a great teacher dies and passes away. They say he goes to nirvana. And so this is the parinirvana of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who died actually April 4th, 1987. And we're celebrating it 3 days early because this is when we have the space. And what we're going to be doing tonight in order to celebrate it is we're going to chant the Sadhana of Mahamudra. And I'm going to say a few words about it now and perhaps a few more during the break. We didn't tell anybody, but if you have a favorite poem or something you would like to read when we take a break, we're going to have a feast, we're going to have some food. There's a time for offerings, and we're derelict in that we didn't advise people in advance. But perhaps you have something that you could get on your phone or on the computer and that you'd like to read or share. Sometimes people play music, sometimes they read poems, sometimes they read something that they've written. We've had dance at these offerings. This is what goes on at feast. So we're going to have a feast tonight, Sadhana of Mahamudra feast. And I'm going to say a few words to start. The Sadhana of Mahamudra is a class of text called terma. Terma means hidden or hidden treasure. And this is peculiar, this kind of text, to the Nyingma tradition, although you find it in the other sects of Tibetan Buddhism as well. And what a terma is that sometime in the distant past, perhaps, it could be not so distant, there's a teacher who had a teaching that an enlightened person that he knew was not appropriate for the people of his or her time. And so they hid that teaching for the future, knowing when that it would be found and even by whom. Peter, I think you're going to have to find a chair in the back. Oh, is there one there? Good. And there are basically two kinds of terma, what are called sater and what are called gomter. Sater are earth terma, and these are actual physical objects that are hidden somewhere. They might have been hidden in the rafters of a house. They might have been hidden in the bed of a stream. They might have been hidden inside solid rock. And the Tertan finds this sater, this physical object. The object might be a text. If it's a text, it's written in Dakini script. Dakinis are these energies, female energies. Daka is male, Dakini is female. And they fly through the sky, and they speak their own language. And when if it's a text, it's written in Dakini script. And as the Tertan reads it for the first time, it's vanishing. But it goes, the text is sort of embedded in the Tertan. A Tertan is a person who finds the terma, treasure finder. And it's embedded in that person's mind. It could be a physical object like a statue of a Buddha or some figure, teacher. And when the Tertan finds it and lays hands on it, the teachings flood into him or her. And then they have it, and they should write it down as fast as they can before they forget it. Gomter, Gom means mind or meditation, are terma, teachings, that come across the ages, through the air, through the Akash, through the space, and will suddenly, the terton will realize that they are receiving it. It's like they're a radio. When Trungpa Rinpoche received Gomter, which he did, he would call for pen and paper, and he would sit down, and it looked like automatic writing. He'd just start writing until the whole text was revealed. This text that we're going to chant tonight is a Gomter. And Trungpa Rinpoche received this text in 1968. He was living in England. He was there studying at Oxford on a fellowship that he had received. And he and his confrere, Akong Tulku, had founded a meditation center in Dumfriesshire, Scotland. And Trungpa Rinpoche was invited by the Queen of Bhutan to come and do a retreat at the famous retreat center called Tagtsang. Now, Tagtsang literally means tiger's nest. And it's called that. It's what it is it's a retreat center that's built on the side of a 2,000-foot cliff. It's really dramatic. And anybody here ever been to Tagtsang? There are people in our Sangha who've gone there. It's in Bhutan. You can go there today. The climb up, I've never been, but the climb up is supposed to be a bit daunting. You start out on a donkey or a mule, and you don't finish on that donkey or mule because the trail gets very narrow with this enormous drop-off. And Trungpa Rinpoche went there with his first Western student, a man named Richard Arthur, who had the Tibetan refuge name of Kungadawa. And he became Rinpoche's foremost student for a number of years. He just passed away a few months ago in Boulder, and we had a sukhavati for him here, and he was a wonderful person and a good friend. And he was with Trungpa Rinpoche when he received this terma, and he helped him translate it into English. Now, Richard Kunga had no Tibetan, and Rinpoche's English was developing, Oxonian Tibetan English. And the translation that they produced was pretty good. And Rinpoche wrote it out and he received it in Tibetan. It was pretty good. There are some oddities in it. And since that time, the Nalanda Translation Committee, which is a bunch of Trungpa Rinpoche students who really became proficient in translation, have done a very precise translation. But Trungpa Rinpoche felt that the translation that he and Kunga did in Bhutan was itself a terma. And so he asks that we still chant that same translation. You'll see some oddities in it, like, for instance, one of them that struck me. There's a reference to the cutting the root of the universal unconscious. And that had to be Kunga, Richard, because this is a Jungian term, universal unconscious, and it's used to translate an ancient Tibetan Buddhist psychological term called the Alaya Vijnana. That's the eighth consciousness. It's the storehouse consciousness, and it's the most fundamental sense of I. When you have this vague feeling that I'm here, I, that's the Alaya. It's the storehouse of all your memories that you're not even thinking about right now, but they're there and they're ready to come to life. And anyhow, so there are lots of things in the sadhana like that, but it's quite beautiful in the way the translation, nonetheless, somewhat poetic. To give you an example, terma are called the fast lineage because other kinds of teachings are handed down from teacher to student to teacher to student over the centuries. Terma leaps the centuries, like this text, which ostensibly comes from Padmasambhava. Most terma come from Padmasambhava, though it's certainly not all. And even the Buddha himself left what amounts to a terma, although nobody ever calls it that, but it certainly fits the description, and that is the Prajnaparamita teachings. Because when the Buddha, gave the Prajnaparamita teachings on Vulture Peak Mountain, right, he knew that the world wasn't ready for the Prajnaparamita. And so he hid those teachings, according to the Mahayana tradition, and he gave them to the Nagas. Nagas are serpent deities who live in water. And in the most powerful Nagas live deep in the ocean. And the Buddha gave the Prajnaparamita teachings to the Nagas to keep until such time as the world was ready for them, which took place in about the 2nd century AD, which is quite a long time. That's about 500-600 years after the Buddha passed. And a famous, probably a teacher who's often called the second Buddha, well, that's an epithet that's given to a number of different people, but his name was Nagarjuna, which means conqueror of the Nagas. And he knew that these teachings existed down beneath the ocean. They were being kept by the Nagas. So using his magical powers, there are different versions of Nagarjuna's life. In this one, he had magical powers, and he went down beneath the ocean, and he created a plague that made all the Nagas sick. They didn't know that it was him doing it. And then he came to them and he offered to cure them of this illness if they would give him the Prajnaparamita teachings. And they agreed to that, and he cured them, and they gave him the teachings, and he brought them back, and we have them. So that's the the version. And they, in essence, they are terma, although nobody really ever refers to the Prajnaparamita teachings as terma, but they certainly fit the description. And there are many, many, many other texts that are regarded as terma, especially and almost exclusively in the Nyingma tradition. You know, one of the 4 main sects of Tibetan Buddhism. There's the Gelugpas, and the Sakyas, and then the Kagyus. Trungpa Rinpoche was Kagyu, and on the shrine we have, there's the Karmapa. He's head of the Kagyu sect, and we also have Dingo Chense Rinpoche, who is Nyingma, right here. And Ponlop Rinpoche is Kagyu and Nyingma both. And Trungpa Rinpoche's main teachers were Nyingma, but he himself was Kagyu. So we have both traditions. And there are many teachings that you might study today that would be terma as you progress along the path. Now, this text has a number of main themes. You will see a reference throughout the text to the central figure of the text, which is, his name is Dorje Trollo Karma Pakshi, and variations on those 2 names. Dorje Trollo is one of the 8 names of Padmasambhava. Karma Pakshi was the second Karmapa, the second head of the Kagyu sect. The Kagyus, they see the Nyingmas trace their roots back to Padmasambhava, who came to Tibet in the 8th century. And that's why they're called the Nyingmas. Nyingma literally means old ones. They trace their roots back the furthest. What happened was that there was a suppression of Buddhism in Tibet during the 10th century. There was an evil king, kind of, for those of you who are Jewish, he was kind of the Haman of Tibetan Buddhism. And he was a king, and he suppressed Buddhism, and he was assassinated. And but during the time of his suppression, Buddhism went underground. And when it came back, up until that time, then the people who sort of brought it back traced their roots back to pre-Haman Buddhism, which went all the way back to Padmasambhava, although actually there was Buddhism in Tibet even before Padmasambhava, about almost 100 years earlier than that. And nobody really knows for sure, because this was literally prehistoric times in Tibet. There wasn't much writing in Tibet until the mid-600s in Tibet, when the king at that time sent one of his ministers to India to get writing. And he brought back the Sanskrit alphabet, and it was adapted to Tibetan language. And today when you read Tibetan, you're reading Sanskrit letters that have been adapted to Tibetan. So, Padmasambhava, and then what happened was that in the 11th century, some people began developing a new strain of Buddhism. They began going to India and coming back with texts which they translated into Tibetan. And these are called the New Translation Schools. And one of the notable one for our purposes is the Kagyu school. The Kagyu school started when a teacher in Tibet, a fellow in Tibet, decided he wanted to make a good living, and that he could do it if he went to India and got a bunch of texts and came back, and he could sort of sell himself as a translator and a teacher. That was Marpa. And Marpa became the founder of the Kagyu sect and became a great Buddhist. And so the reason I'm telling you this is that this text, in this text that we're going to read tonight, Trungpa Rinpoche brought together both schools, both traditions. And the central figure is called Dorje Trolo Karma Pakshi. Dorje Trolo is one of the 8 names for Padmasambhava, the founder, so-called maybe, of the Nyingma school. And Karma Pakshi is one of the, he's the second head of the Kagyu school. Now what happened was the Kagyu school was founded by Marpa, and then he had a student, Milarepa, who was a great yogi, and Milarepa had a student named Gampopa, and Gampopa was a monk. He was the first monk in the Kagyu tradition. And he founded sort of the monastic tradition of the Kagyus being monastics. And he had a number of close students, one of whom was named Knower of the 3 Times. His name is Tusum Khenpa, which you'll see in this text. And he became the first Karmapa, the first head of the Kagyu sect under his teacher Gampopa. And then there were a succession of them until we get to the current Karmapa, who's the second from the left over there. And that's, what's his name? Dorje Trinley? And he's the 17th in his line. And Trungpa Rinpoche brought the 16th to this country as well. So they're an amalgam, the central figure of this sadhana. And actually, I'm going to show you, Trungpa Rinpoche had a friend of his who was a Thangka painter and a student of his paint a Thangka of the Sadhana of Mahamudra. I'm going to pass this around, I hope. I've got it here. If I don't, it's in my briefcase. I think it's in the briefcase. Could somebody look in there? In the front pocket somewhere, there is a photograph of the Sadhana of Mahamudra Mudra Thangka. There it is. Great. And you'll see that, I'm going to explain this. Well, we're going to pass this around. That, you see, he's red. That's Dorje Trolo. Dorje Trolo is the wrathful aspect of Padmasambhava. Dorje means adamantine, Trolo means wrathful one. And it's the aspect that he picked, that he assumed, when he went to Bhutan and meditated in the caves that Trungpa Rinpoche meditated in 20 centuries, or no, I guess about 12 centuries later. And he meditated there because what he was doing was, in advance, subduing the demons who were going to obstruct the arrival of Buddhism in Tibet. And he was sort of doing this mentally, subduing these wrathful forces, these demons. And he went there with his consort, who was a princess, an Indian princess named Mandarava. And she was pregnant. And she is represented in this as a pregnant tigress. And she became a great teacher and a terton in her own right. She was a student of Padmasambhava's and his consort. And so you'll see that this figure is riding on a tigress, who you might not be able to tell, but that tigress is pregnant. And it's quite fierce in many different depictions. This tigress often has a corpse in its mouth representing ego. And so he's red, he's in flames. That's Dorje Trolo. That's the wrathful aspect of Padmasambhava. And he's wearing a black hat. The black hat is the symbol of the Karmapas. And what happened was, this is an interesting story. I'm going to give you lots of stories because they're fun. The 5th Karmapa, Deshin Shegpa, his name was, he went to China. You see, what happened was that Tibetans began, back in the 1100s, when the Mongols swept across China, across Asia, and eventually conquered China in 1189. they invited, they went to Tibet. Well, they didn't. They sent emissaries, and they said basically, this is what they did with a lot of kingdoms. They said, look, we can come down there and really just wreck you, or you can agree to be our subjects, send us tribute, meaning wealth, periodically, like every year, and send us a representative through whom we will rule you. And the first, the Tibetans said, oh no, we don't want you to come down here. And so they sent up the head of the Sakya sect, Sakya Pandita, and this is in the 12th century. And he became the guru to Genghis Khan. I think I've got it right. Genghis was the first one, and then Kublai was his grandson. And he became the sort of the guru. There are lots of interesting stories. You can read the accounts of the Sakya Pandita. Genghis Khan would take him riding on horseback, and they'd be riding along talking, and then out of nowhere Genghis Khan would pull an arrow out of his quiver and shoot a bird out of the sky, and also if the population, the Chinese, they hadn't yet invaded and taken over China when the Sakya Pandita went up there, and if the population around them, the Chinese population, got too thick, they thought the Mongols started to think this is a little dangerous. They would just round up a whole bunch of Chinese people and take them down and drown them in the river. So the Sakya Pandita convinced the Khan this wasn't a good idea. They'd be accruing lots of bad karma. And he became the Khan's teacher. And after that, he established what was called the patron-priest relationship. And in fact, the Dalai Lama is from a long tradition of priests to the Mongols, and the word Dalai Lama is a combination of Tibetan and Mongol. Lama is Tibetan, means guru, and Dalai means ocean, so the ocean guru, and this established that tradition. Now, then the Karmapas started going up as well. To visit the Mongols. They were invited up, and they would give teachings, and some of the Mongols became quite devout. In particular, the fifth Karmapa went, I forget the name of the particular Mongol ruler at that time, but he became very devout. And the story goes that he had a vision. He saw the fifth Karmapa Deshin Shegpa in front of him, but he saw him in a way that was quite magical. And he saw him wearing a black hat. And that's the black hat that you'll see on top of Dorji Trullo Karmapakshi's head. And this is the ceremony that the Karmapas always perform when they come. They do this black hat ceremony. This black hat was, and maybe is, I don't know, made from Dakini pubic hair. The Dakinis were very devoted to the Karmapas, and they shaved their own pubic hair and made this black hat for him to wear. And so that's the story behind that black hat. I'm going to pass this around, and you'll see that he's red, he's wrathful, and he's riding on a tigress, which he did in Bhutan, just where Trungpa Rinpoche. There's no accident Trungpa Rinpoche received this at the cave of Tagtsang. Tagtsang means tiger's lair, tiger's nest. And it's that tiger, Princess Mandarava, and her consort Padmasambhava. Trungpa Rinpoche, I always loved it. He described the toilet at Tagtsang. And the toilet was nicknamed the Long Drop. For reasons you can imagine. I mean, a 2,000-foot sheer cliff with these very, crude buildings built into the side of it. It's quite something. So he did this long retreat there, and not that long. I think it was a number of weeks, and it produced the Sadhana of Mahamudra. Any questions about this before we go on? That was in 1968.
Yeah, I have one question.
Yes.
You mentioned that you witnessed the Vidyahara revealing a terma once. You mentioned.
I didn't witness it. I just had it described to me. There are other people who were closer to him at that time.
At any rate, the implication is that he revealed more than this terma. How many
Oh.
did he
Many. Many. He was a famous terton, and in fact, it means a finder of revealed texts. Oh, good. Thank you. And we didn't know it. You see, he came here when he was 19. And we just thought he started receiving mind terma. Oh, he was past 30. He was here in this country. I don't know if he received any terma other than the Sadhana of Mahamudra before he came to the United States. But then he started getting the Shambhala teachings, and the Shambhala teachings are built on terma that he received about Shambhala. And if you go through Shambhala training, the Shambhala levels, you will start at some point to be given terma. The first you receive is called the Letter of the Black Ashe, and it's quite beautiful. And in fact, if you want to see this, there's a book called Shambhala, The Path of the Warrior. It's been around for a long time now, 20, 30 years at least. And in the very beginning of that book, in the first few pages, there is, even though the terma are secret, Trungpa Rinpoche gave permission for the first page of the Letter of the Black Ashe to be printed. And it's there with facing Tibetan on the left side and the English on the right. It's very beautiful, and it's key. It's very essential Shambhala teachings that have there. It's all about having fundamental confidence in Buddha nature and what that produces, and what happens when we lose confidence in our Buddha nature. And it's a powerful teaching. You can take a look at that. Then, after the Vidyadhara died, some Tibetans started coming, and they told us, and then one in particular, who is it? Kusum Lingpa? No, there's another one who collected Trungpa Rinpoche's terma from Tibet. And they were actual physical terma that he had found and discovered that he never told us about. And that the Tibetans had, one of his cousins who never knew him, had been collecting those terma, and he'd been bringing them now for the last 15 years to this country. Huh? I forget his name. But the translators up in Nova Scotia, Larry Mermelstein, Mark Nowakowski, work with him, and they've been translating those terma.
They're in Tibet. They're in China now.
They're in China. Yeah, Larry's in China, and so is Mark, working with those teachers.
And Scott.
And Scott? These are members of the Nalanda Translation Committee. So they brought back this, suddenly we have these physical terma that come from Tibet. Okay. This text is a terma. If you look at the text itself, not the italicized section, you will see at the end of every line, turn the page, because you're looking at the italics on the first page. You will see at the end of every line a symbol. It's a horizontal line with a small circle above and a small circle below it. When you see that symbol, you know that what preceded it is terma. And when you don't see it, it's not. Okay? Now, so one of the main themes in this text is bringing together these two lineages, Nyingma and Kagyu. And that's represented in that central figure. Now, Padmasambhava has a number of names. He has 8 names, actually. And Dorje Trollo is the wrathful one for his manifestation at Tongtsang. But there are other names that appear in this text. Padmakara, you'll see, that means the same thing as Padmasambhava. It means, both of them mean born or arisen from a lotus. Because the story about Padmasambhava is that he was born fully formed at the age of 7 on a lotus. He appeared. And what it's symbolic of, you see, is that our Buddha nature, our enlightened mind, doesn't develop. It's already there, fully formed in us, sitting on a lotus. And the lotus is symbolic because its roots go down into filth, into muck, and this beautiful flower rises out of the mud and the muck. And Padmasambhava is sitting on it. That's your enlightened mind. what else? We've got a lot of different karmapas in here. And you'll hear them talking about the karma, different karmapas, the names. Rangjung Dorje is the manifestation of enlightened mind. Mikyo Dorje is speech. You see, it always goes, and Tusum Khenpa, he's another, these are all karmapas. Tusum Khenpa is the first karmapa. He represents body. Now, body is in the head, believe it or not. This is the body. And speech is in the throat. This is where Mikyo Dorje lives. So Rangjung Dorje, who represents the body, is up here in the skull. Mikyo Dorje, he was the 8th karmapa, and he was a brilliant speaker and teacher. And he represents enlightened speech, and he lives in the throat chakra. And then Rangjung Dorje, who was the 3rd karmapa and was absolutely brilliant human being, represents enlightened mind, and he lives in the heart center. And so these will be referred to in the text. Another main theme of this text is overcoming spiritual materialism. Spiritual materialism is the way in which spirituality is perverted. It's perverted by being used for egocentric and selfish purposes. Me and my betterment. It has, as opposed to being developed spirituality as a vehicle for the truth and for compassion for all sentient beings. But when it's perverted, then, the ultimate perversion is people who want to be famous and wealthy and sell the Dharma and themselves to that end. That's a terrible perversion. But even when we say, I want to get enlightened, I want to be happy, and I'm going to use meditation and spirituality to achieve my own personal happiness, that's spiritual materialism. So for instance, there are practices which are done in the Hindu tradition, which if carried to an extreme, become spiritual materialism. And I'll give you an example of these, and they can also be done in the Buddhist tradition. And the classic example of this is concentration on an object so developed, so intense, that you achieve a trance state. You become locked, your attention, onto the object. And these trance states are blissful. And in TM, they talk a lot about people levitating, and achieving great states of bliss. These are regarded by Buddhists as being cul-de-sacs, dead ends. You can get stuck there for a long time, and they are sort of the ultimate examples of spiritual materialism, using spirituality for ego's gratification. And they're dangerous. So they're practiced in the Buddhist tradition, but only in a limited way. They're practiced in the form of shamatha, where you are focusing your mind one-pointedly on an object. It might be the breath, might be a mantra, and it has a number of virtues if it's not carried to an extreme. It has the virtue of showing you the extent to which you're lost in thought. It has the virtue of developing your ability to concentrate, to come back from thought, and be in a state of awareness. And what's the other? There's a third virtue of shamatha. It doesn't come to me right now. So it's practice, but then you have to go beyond it. Or it can become a cul-de-sac, especially if it's taken to an extreme. And there are lots of stories about great teachers like Khyentse Rinpoche here, finding yogis who had gotten stuck. Maybe they'd gone off into a cave and spent years developing their powers of concentration. And they'd gotten stuck in a trance state. And supposedly you can become so fixed that the body, the physical body, withers away until, as they say in the texts, all that remains is a palpitating heart. And Khyentse Rinpoche was famous for going and finding yogis who'd gotten stuck in these states. They're called the dhyanas in Sanskrit, or the jhana states in Pali, and then waking them up and saying, "You're stuck, get out of this, move on." You got to go back and do the work. You can't hang out in this bliss state anymore. active compassion. So there is a reference in the very beginning of the text to the three lords of materialism, and they are the Lord of speech, the Lord of form, the Lord of speech, and the Lord of mind. The Lord of mind is spiritual materialism. That's like using these trance states, using spirituality in any way. The Lord of speech, these are lords who enslave us. In fact, in Tibetan, they're actually called barbarians. They're called lalo. And lalo is the word for barbarian. I have a theory. The etymology of the word barbarian itself is that the Greeks thought that anybody who didn't speak Greek was talking gibberish and was saying bar, 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 like that. And my theory is that, and the Chinese did the same thing. Non-Chinese were, the word for non-Chinese, barbarian, translated as barbarian, is Pretty evocative, don't you think? That's Chinese for barbarian, non-Han Chinese. And the word in Tibetan is lalo. And these are the lalo sum, the three barbarians. Sum means three. And the Lord of form has to do with the manipulation of the physical world, like getting rich maybe, to achieve happiness. Although it could be, you could actually, go and practice austerities and simplicity to achieve happiness, and that could be the same thing. Just the flip side, still the Lord of form. Lord of speech has to do with adoption of a philosophy, an ideology, and it's trying to achieve happiness in that way. So you might become really a professional religious, like a professional Buddhist or a professional Christian, and really devout, and you are on the side of good. You might become a devout Republican or a devout Democrat or a socialist or a communist. I've often thought that, when I was in undergraduate and then in graduate school, my field of study was Chinese communism. That was my focus back in the late 60s. Cultural Revolution was in full swing. And I've often thought that Chinese communism, as it was employed during the Cultural Revolution especially, was the most monolithic application of the Lord of speech that the world has ever seen. A whole country of 1 billion people ordering their lives according to the ideas of Chinese communism, and these ideas being broadcast in villages on loudspeakers attached to poles, and everybody carrying around a book of the sayings of Chairman Mao, and trying to live their lives in accord. And then we have the Lord of Mind, which I've already described, I think. So that's a big theme here. And then a third theme is, and you'll see this throughout, is the attainment of Mahamudra mind, Dzogchen mind. Mahamudra is the Kagyu term for it. Dzogchen, great perfection, is the Nyingma term for it. And Mahamudra means great symbol. And what this refers to is the mind of reality. It's the mind that rests in the present moment, completely clear, effortless, and sees things as they are, and rouses great compassion at the same time. Because compassion and clarity go together in Mahamudra mind. And this is one of the main themes throughout this. We're going to start. The first section is Refuge and bodhichitta. Refuge means you're taking refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, which is sort of getting locked into the path, And then the bodhichitta is that you are dedicating the benefit to all sentient beings, which is a very egoless thing to do. And that's a good thing to do, to give up your ego by giving away the benefit. And actually, you are not giving it completely away, because you're achieving what's called the twofold benefit, self and others. But the emphasis is really on the others. And that's the very first section that we're going to chant. It's really quite beautiful and fierce. It's a refuge in bodhicitta like you will find nowhere else. Yes? We're not going to record it. No, we're not. Okay. So I think we're probably ready to start. So we could turn off the... this is a secret, by the way. Before you turn it off, I just want to say, this text is protected. There are rules for how this text is chanted, given out, and the basic rule is this. Until you do a weekend training on this text, at least a weekend, that we could do, it's we all day, start probably Friday night, go all day Saturday, all day Sunday. Until then, you're not allowed to own the text. You're only allowed to chant it and do it in this kind of a setting, in a center. But once we do that weekend, then you can own your own copy and you can take it home and you can even do retreats. There are Sadhana of Mahamudra retreats that you can do and practices. So I would very much like to do a weekend here so that people who wished could own this text and take it home. I was fortunate. I met the Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche in 1970, and they were handing this text out to anybody who asked for it. And it was being run off on a mimeograph machine, and I've still got my mimeograph. It's in legal-sized yellow sheets. Really funny. So I would love to see everybody here owning it. So let's turn off the recording.